On television, it was pitched as the ultimate athletic arena, a fair path for a college powerhouse to fight her way to superstardom. But behind the closed doors of WWE's production set, the reality was a meticulously engineered trap. This is the twisted truth behind Paulina Thomas's reality TV debut, how a multi-billion-dollar corporation filmed a catastrophic injury, disguised medical negligence as television drama, and discarded a physically broken woman to protect their bottom line. How did a dream of glory become a brutal corporate extraction? The television industry at the turn of the millennium was undergoing a highly lucrative, entirely unregulated mutation. Network executives had exhausted the traditional financial models of scripted programming and discovered a far more efficient method of capital extraction, the commercialization of raw, unscripted human stress. World Wrestling Entertainment, an empire already heavily reliant on the exploitation of independent contractors, recognized the unprecedented financial potential of this new format. When they launched the first season of Tough Enough in 2001, the marketing campaign projected a democratic, merit-based athletic combine. The public was sold the illusion of a grueling but fair pathway to professional wrestling superstardom. The reality, operating behind the closed doors of the production set, was a highly sophisticated psychological laboratory designed to identify, isolate, and systematically dismantle human targets, completely discarding the notion that reality television casting functions as a search for talent reveals the specific calculated tragedy of Paulina Thomas. It is a forensic search for vulnerability. When the production team reviewed the thousands of audition tapes, Paulina's profile immediately triggered the specific parameters of their casting blueprint. Hailing from Colorado, she was a legitimate collegiate athlete, possessing a physical architecture that was an absolute anomaly within the female entertainment demographic. Standing 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighing a densely muscled 185 pounds, she projected an aura of impenetrable physical dominance. To the television audience, she would appear as the ultimate, indestructible competitor. To the psychological profilers employed by the production company, she represented the perfect, high-value prey. The narrative, heavily promoted by the broadcasting network, suggested that Paulina, driven by vanity and a sudden desire for Hollywood stardom, abandoned her athletic roots for reality television. This is a deliberate, corporate manufactured fallacy. Bypassing any pursuit of fame, the decision to audition for Tough Enough manifested strictly as a desperate, calculated response to an absolute economic vacuum. During her tenure at the university in Colorado, Paulina existed within the highly restrictive, fundamentally exploitative financial structure of the National Collegiate Athletic Association, NCAA, amateurism rules. As a Division I track and field athlete specializing in heavy throwing events, specifically the shot put and discus, her physical output generated immense prestige and institutional funding for the university. However, under the strict regulations of the era, she was legally prohibited from monetizing her own biomechanical labor. She was provided a standard athletic scholarship to cover tuition and a heavily restricted meal plan, but she lived in functional poverty. Maintaining a heavily muscled 185-pound frame required a daily intake of 4,000 high-quality calories, specialized joint supplements, and constant physiological maintenance. The financial burden of merely sustaining her body frequently exceeded the meager allowances permitted by the athletic department. forcing her to rely on compounding student debt just to survive her collegiate eligibility. Furthermore, unlike female athletes competing in mainstream sports such as basketball, who possess the newly formed WNBA as a potential, albeit underfunded professional landing zone, strength athletes like Paulina faced a catastrophic professional cliff. The moment she exhausted her final year of NCAA eligibility, the million-dollar university infrastructure supporting her, the state-of-the-art weight rooms, the team of physical therapists, the dedicated sports psychologists, and the synchronized training schedules would vanish overnight. For a woman of her specific imposing physical architecture, the traditional athletic job market was non-existent. She was graduating into a void, possessing elite physical capabilities, but absolutely zero avenues to legally monetize them in a regulated sporting environment. World Wrestling Entertainment did not need to dispatch scouts to infiltrate collegiate facilities. The economic desperation of the NCAA system did the recruiting for them. Faced with the terrifying prospect of abandoning her physical discipline to work a minimum wage civilian job, Paulina actively sought a lifeline. When MTV and WWE announced an open casting call for Tough Enough, she did not see a chaotic, unregulated circus of reality television. She saw a premier athletic opportunity. The audition process itself, however, was a masterclass in financial attrition. The preliminary casting calls required the athletes to absorb the entirety of the logistical costs. Paulina was forced to mail in her audition tape and subsequently max out her remaining high-interest collegiate credit cards to afford the cross-country flights, hotel accommodations, and specialized grappling gear required for the tryouts. By the time she arrived at the final selection camp, she was already heavily leveraged and financially dependent on securing the contract. During these initial physical assessments, the scouts maintained the illusion of a strict merit-based athletic combine. They subjected the recruits to grueling cardiovascular tests and complex weightlifting regimens, mirroring the environment Paulina had thrived in at the university. However, investigative records into the casting process later revealed that the producers were entirely disregarding the athletic data, completely disregarding her biomechanical efficiency or kinetic output. The producers evaluated her exclusively on her visual marketability as an intimidating physical anomaly. The athletic combine was merely a highly structured theatrical performance designed to lower the defenses of the recruits, convincing them they were entering a professional sporting organization rather than an unregulated television set. The fatal transition from protected NCAA athlete to unprotected corporate asset was finalized in a sterile hotel conference room in Stamford, Connecticut. After weeks of exhausting physical tryouts and mounting personal debt, Paulina was presented with the Tough Enough participation contract. The executives deliberately engineered a high-pressure environment, providing her with a dense 40-page legal document and a strict 24-hour deadline to sign. At 22 years old, isolated from her family, and lacking the financial resources to retain independent legal counsel, she was entirely unequipped to decipher the labyrinth of liability waivers, perpetual image rights clauses, and independent contractor designations buried within the text. The WWE attorneys had meticulously crafted an agreement that effectively stripped her of every fundamental labor protection she had unknowingly enjoyed at the university level. She believed she was signing a document that validated her lifetime of physical discipline and secured her economic future. In reality, she was legally signing away her right to a safe workplace, authorizing the monetization of her impending psychological destruction, and walking directly into the corporate meat grinder. The producers utilized extensive personality assessments and background evaluations to map Paulina's psychological framework. They recognized that a young woman accustomed to the heavily structured, deeply supportive, and strictly rule-bound environment of collegiate athletics was fundamentally unequipped to navigate a corporate television set designed entirely around deception. In a university athletic program, the objective is peak performance, and the coaching staff exists to support the athlete. In the WWE reality television apparatus, the objective is primetime drama, and the production staff exists to engineer the athlete's emotional collapse. The casting directors identified her deeply ingrained collegiate confidence not as an asset to be nurtured, but as a specific target to be broken on camera. The higher the pedestal of her initial confidence, the more dramatic and profitable the televised fall would be. The moment Paulina signed the highly restrictive production contracts and arrived on location, the corporate machine initiated a meticulous architecture of forced isolation. This is the foundational tactic of any coercive environment. To successfully manipulate a human being, the architect must first strip away their established baseline of reality. The producers immediately severed her connection to Colorado. They confiscated communication devices, restricted internet access, and entirely eliminated her ability to contact her family, her former coaches, or any trusted external advisors. She was physically and geographically marooned. Far exceeding a mere logistical necessity for filming, this strict isolation functioned explicitly as a deliberate psychological weapon. By cutting off her external support system, the production company forced Paulina into a state of absolute dependence. The directors, the corporate trainers, and the camera operators became her only source of information, her only source of validation, and her entire reality. She was trapped in a completely manufactured ecosystem where the corporation controlled the physical space, the schedule, and the narrative. With the target successfully isolated, the producers initiated the next phase of the extraction, the systematic erosion of her physiological and emotional baseline. They weaponized the environment to induce a constant underlying state of biological stress. The filming schedule was deliberately erratic and punishing. Paulina and the other contestants were subjected to extreme sleep deprivation, routinely awakened in the middle of the night to execute grueling physical drills under the blinding glare of stadium lighting. The human brain, when starved of REM sleep, rapidly loses its capacity for emotional regulation and rational decision-making. Cortisol levels spike, trapping the individual in a perpetual state of fight or flight. The producers were intentionally exhausting her central nervous system so that when the psychological pressure was applied, she would lack the biological reserves to maintain her composure. To accelerate this mental destabilization, the production staff deployed a highly effective invisible mechanism of control, the weaponization of information. Off-camera production assistants and junior crew members were utilized to plant calculated, conflicting rumors among the contestants. They would quietly leak false narratives regarding which competitors the WWE executives secretly favored, or who was currently targeted for elimination. This manufactured paranoia acted as a corrosive agent within the house. For Paulina, who had been internally classified as a top contender due to her imposing physical size, this constant stream of deceptive information created an atmosphere of suffocating anxiety. She could not trust her peers, she could not trust the trainers, and she could not trust her own assessment of her standing in the competition. The producers were actively gaslighting her, eroding her confidence inch by inch before she ever stepped into a wrestling ring. The final component of this psychological gauntlet was the deliberate engineering of social collision. Reality television relies on conflict, but organic conflict is too unpredictable for a strict broadcast schedule. The producers meticulously cast opposing psychological archetypes and forced them into confined spaces to guarantee an explosion. They intentionally placed Paulina in direct, inescapable proximity with contestants possessing diametrically opposed core values. The most prominent and destructive of these manufactured dynamics was her heavily publicized feud with a fellow contestant named Goldilocks. This relationship was not a natural rivalry born of athletic competition. It was a highly calculated corporate setup. Goldilocks was cast specifically for her abrasive, hyper-aggressive entertainment persona, a stark contrast to Paulina's disciplined, team-oriented athletic background. The producers understood that placing a traditional athlete next to a chaotic, camera-hungry personality would inevitably trigger a profound conflict of core values. They manipulated the living arrangements, the training groupings, and the interview segments to ensure these two opposing forces were constantly grinding against one another. When the inevitable friction ignited, the cameras were perfectly positioned to capture the fallout. Paulina, exhausted by sleep deprivation, isolated from her family, and drowning in production-engineered paranoia, reacted exactly as the psychological profilers had predicted. Her collegiate composure fractured. Stripped of any authentic human interaction, the resulting arguments and emotional breakdowns served strictly as the direct intended output of a highly sophisticated psychological extraction process. The corporation had successfully taken a physically dominant, confident athlete from Colorado and, through a brutal architecture of isolation and manipulation, reduced her to a highly volatile television character. The psychological foundation had been successfully shattered. The machine was now fully prepared to initiate the physical destruction of the asset. The transition from psychological destabilization to explicit physical degradation on the set of Tough Enough was executed with a swift, unapologetic cruelty. The television audience tuned into the broadcast, operating under a carefully constructed illusion. They believed they were watching a grueling athletic combine, a specialized training camp where aspiring performers would be taught the complex, highly dangerous mechanics of professional grappling. They expected to see the recruits learning how to execute precise wrist locks, how to safely distribute their body weight during a high-velocity throw, and how to protect their cervical spines upon impact with the canvas. This was the promise of the industry. The reality, however, was a blatant manifestation of corporate misogyny and severe occupational negligence. When Paulina Thomas stepped onto the set, the producers did not look at her imposing 6'3", highly conditioned athletic frame and see a future professional wrestler to be trained. They saw a physical novelty to be exploited. Instead of directing the female recruits to the standard wrestling ring for technical instruction, the production mandated their participation in highly sexualized, deeply degrading mud wrestling segments. Mud wrestling is not a recognized athletic training protocol. It is a cheap, voyeuristic stunt designed entirely to stimulate the lowest common denominator of the viewing demographic. For an athlete of Paulina's size and weight, grappling in a pit of wet mud represents a catastrophic physical hazard. The mud entirely obscures the solid, unforgiving surface beneath it. It destroys any possibility of establishing a secure, stable foothold. When a 185-pound athlete attempts to plant their foot, shift their weight, or execute a throw on an inherently unstable, frictionless surface, it generates massive, entirely unpredictable torque across the ligaments of the lower extremities. The corporate executives and the on-site trainers were acutely aware of these dangers. They completely ignored fundamental occupational safety standards, prioritizing the immediate, highly profitable visual of women fighting in the mud over the structural integrity of their human assets. They deliberately placed a legitimate collegiate athlete into an environment designed for humiliation rather than athletic development, treating her body as a disposable commodity for a temporary rating spike. Under the immense, unrelenting stress of these unregulated physical challenges, the inevitable biological failure occurred. The human knee is a complex, load-bearing hinge, entirely reliant on a delicate network of ligaments and cartilage to maintain structural stability. Subjected to the extreme torque of the production's poorly supervised stunts, Paulina's knee catastrophically gave out. The ligaments tore. The joint fundamentally collapsed, sending a blinding, paralyzing wave of orthopedic agony through her central nervous system. In any legitimate sporting arena or regulated workplace, this specific, highly visible manifestation of acute joint trauma triggers a non-negotiable medical protocol. The event is instantly halted. Independent emergency medical technicians secure the injured limb, and the athlete is rapidly evacuated to an orthopedic specialist for high-resolution imaging and surgical intervention. The corporation's fiduciary and moral duty is the immediate preservation of the employee's health. The World Wrestling Entertainment production crew operated under a fundamentally sociopathic paradigm. When Paulina collapsed, clutching her ruined knee in genuine, unscripted agony, the director and the production truck did not call for a medical evacuation. They commanded the camera operators to push in closer. The cameras encroached upon her physical trauma, meticulously capturing the sweat, the panic, and the authentic, agonizing realization that her body had just failed her. The corporation did not provide immediate medical relief. They actively harvested her suffering. This singular, devastating moment of biological collapse was transformed into a highly valuable piece of corporate intellectual property. The exploitation extended deep into the post-production editing bays, where the reality of her injury was systematically rewritten. The production team utilized a highly deceptive, deeply unethical audio manipulation technique known within the industry as frankenbiting. The editors combed through hundreds of hours of raw footage, isolating disparate audio recordings of Paulina expressing pain, asking for medical ice, or groaning in the aftermath of the injury. They then digitally stitched these isolated audio fragments over unrelated footage of her interacting with other contestants or struggling with minor drills. By aggressively manipulating the audio and visual context, the producers fundamentally altered the broadcast narrative, deliberately bearing the truth of an elite athlete suffering a severe, career-threatening orthopedic injury due to corporate negligence. They explicitly weaponized the footage to present Paulina as a weak, emotionally fragile woman who simply lacked the physical fortitude required for the professional wrestling industry. They assassinated her character on global television, transforming her legitimate cries for medical help into a fabricated, serialized storyline of mental weakness. This manufactured narrative spanned 5 subsequent episodes, milking her trauma for maximum dramatic tension while simultaneously protecting the company from any public scrutiny regarding their unsafe working conditions. However, the most chilling maneuver executed by the corporate apparatus occurred away from the cameras, in the sterile, highly controlled environment of the production office. The WWE legal and executive departments recognized that a documented severe physical injury sustained on their television set constituted a massive, looming financial liability. If Paulina was formally medically disqualified by a company physician, the corporation would be legally bound by standard workplace liability to cover the exorbitant costs of her reconstructive knee surgery, the months of specialized physical therapy, and potential long-term disability claims. To evade this financial responsibility, the production team engaged in a ruthless campaign of coercive persuasion. They utilized the intense artificial pressure of the reality television environment to corner the injured, highly medicated 22-year-old. They isolated Paulina and subjected her to intense group pressure from the trainers and producers. They subtly, continuously implied that acknowledging the severity of her injury and requiring formal medical intervention was a personal disgrace. They framed the situation to suggest that true athletes simply tough it out, manipulating her deeply ingrained athletic pride. Simultaneously, they leveraged her exhaustion and her complete lack of independent legal counsel. The producers engineered a psychological trap where Paulina felt the only dignified, honorable exit from the unbearable pressure was to look directly into the confessional camera and state that she was voluntarily withdrawing from the competition. Shattering any illusion of a tragic, heroic resignation, this maneuver operated entirely as a perfectly executed, bloodless legal extraction. The exact fraction of a second those words were captured on tape, the multi-billion-dollar entertainment monopoly successfully severed all legal and financial liability. By manipulating the situation to frame her departure as a voluntary personal choice rather than a mandatory medical disqualification resulting from workplace negligence, the WWE successfully shifted the entire devastating financial burden of the shattered knee directly onto the victim. Paulina Thomas was forced to hobble off the production set, entirely discarded by the corporate machine. She carried the agonizing weight of a ruined joint, a maliciously manipulated public image, and the toxic, lingering illusion that she had somehow failed the test, completely unaware that the multi-billion-dollar machine had meticulously rigged the game against her biology from the moment she signed the contract. The physical exile from the World Wrestling Entertainment production set did not sever Paulina Thomas's psychological tether to the toxic illusion of fame. When a reality television apparatus ejects a contestant, it leaves behind a highly destructive residual effect, an artificially inflated, entirely theoretical market valuation. The corporate machine had broadcast her image into millions of homes, manufacturing a temporary, highly volatile public recognition. In the brutal, unregulated economy of the secondary entertainment industry, exposure is frequently and dangerously mistaken for actual financial equity. Paulina was ejected back into the civilian world, carrying the agonizing burden of a severely compromised knee. but she was simultaneously infected with the desperate, blinding necessity to prove her corporate detractors wrong. In the immediate aftermath of her tough enough departure, Paulina was targeted by the secondary tier of the professional wrestling ecosystem. She was swiftly contracted by NWA TNA, Total Nonstop Action, an upstart promotion desperately attempting to establish a national footprint by capitalizing on any lingering mainstream television momentum left behind by the WWE monopoly. The executives at TNA did not hire her to execute complex athletic contests. They were acutely aware that her physical foundation was already ruined. Instead, they weaponized her imposing 6'3" frame and the lingering notoriety of her reality television stint, casting her in the superficial, highly visible role of a silent, intimidating bodyguard for the veteran performer Disco Inferno. This specific booking was a masterstroke of industry manipulation, creating a devastating financial paradox that would haunt Paulina for the next 2 decades. To the television audience, the booking successfully maintained the illusion that she was a rising, highly sought-after star. Standing at ringside, projecting absolute physical dominance and interacting with established wrestling veterans, Paulina received a profound psychological high. The environment fed the exact ego the reality show had attempted to break, validating her presence in the industry. However, the financial reality operating behind the curtain was one of profound systemic exploitation. Paulina was operating on low-tier per-appearance contracts. She was not a salaried employee. She was an independent contractor responsible for her own travel logistics, her own lodging, and her own medical care. Most critically, she was entirely responsible for funding the extravagant, polished aesthetic demanded of a national television personality. The industry had successfully trapped her in a crushing economic vice. She was contractually required to spend the capital of a superstar simply to look like one, while being compensated with the wages of an entry-level extra. This desperate necessity to maintain a flawless public facade transformed Paulina into the perfect, highly vulnerable target for the most ruthless predators operating on the periphery of the entertainment sector, lifestyle managers, and brand consultants. When an athlete projects an aura of immense success but lacks fundamental financial literacy and actual cash flow, they attract a specific breed of corporate parasite. As her television appearances in TNA generated a superficial buzz, a network of opportunistic agents circled her. They presented themselves as industry saviors, speaking the seductive, sophisticated language of brand development, franchise expansion, and synergy. Paulina, fundamentally unequipped to navigate the predatory legalities of entertainment management and desperate to secure her precarious position in the industry, signed agreements that effectively surrendered her entire financial autonomy. These management contracts were not designed to build a sustainable business empire. They were constructed entirely as mechanisms of wealth extraction. The agents secured exorbitant percentages of her gross income, meaning they took their cut before taxes, travel expenses, or medical bills were ever paid. They inserted draconian perpetuity clauses into the paperwork, legally binding her image rights indefinitely and seizing total control over any potential merchandising revenue. The management firms were systematically strip mining her temporary reality television fame, securing their own profit margins while entirely shielding themselves from her mounting liabilities. To fund the illusion of her burgeoning empire and satisfy the requirements of her new management team, Paulina was ushered into a highly destructive architecture of debt. The managers introduced her to the shadowy world of predatory bridge loans. These are short-term, aggressively high-interest capital injections designed specifically for entertainers waiting for a hypothetical big break. The strategy engineered by her management team was to heavily leverage her future earning potential. They convinced Paulina that in order to attract legitimate, high-paying corporate endorsements or major acting roles, she had to visually project overwhelming success. Under their direction, Paulina utilized these high-interest loans to lease luxury vehicles she could not afford. She rented expensive, high-profile real estate to serve as a backdrop for promotional materials. She was instructed to maintain a constant, highly curated presence at elite social events, paying for premium VIP access and designer wardrobes entirely on credit. It was a terrifying, highly leveraged gamble, utilizing her own heavily mortgaged future as collateral. The psychological terror of existing inside this financial house of cards is absolute. Every time Paulina stepped into a public arena or posed for a promotional photograph, she was acutely aware of the massive discrepancy between her perceived wealth and her actual insolvency. The cash flow generated from her sporadic TNA wrestling appearances and minor autograph signings was completely inadequate to service the compounding interest of the bridge loans, let alone touch the principal debt. She was financially bleeding out in plain sight, her total bankruptcy temporarily hidden behind a carefully constructed wall of professional makeup, paid public relations teams, and leased luxury goods. She was no longer an athlete. She was a hostage to her own brand. The knee she had sacrificed on the reality television set continued to deteriorate, a constant source of chronic physical agony that she could not afford to properly treat because every available dollar was being aggressively funneled into debt service and image maintenance. The corporate machine of the early 2000s had successfully convinced a young collegiate athlete that fame was a tangible asset. In reality, they had handed her a highly toxic liability, wrapped it in a television contract, and stepped back to watch the ensuing financial devastation consume the remainder of her adult life. By the time the calendar advanced into the 2020s, the heavily leveraged, debt-fueled architecture of Paulina Thomas's public life reached the absolute threshold of structural failure. The bridge loans, secured years prior under the predatory guidance of her management team, finally matured. The exorbitant interest rates, which had been quietly compounding in the background while she attempted to project an image of television royalty, reached critical mass. The period between 2023 and 2026 marks the brutal, involuntary liquidation of the reality television facade, a highly traumatic financial process that stripped her of every remaining tangible asset. When a highly leveraged individual exhausts their cash reserves, the financial sector executes a merciless extraction protocol. Paulina was forced into a rapid sequence of forced asset liquidations. The luxury vehicles, the high-end real estate leases, and the designer wardrobes that had been purchased at absolute premium retail prices to construct her public persona were seized by creditors. The mathematics of a forced liquidation are inherently punitive. When luxury goods are repossessed and sold on the secondary market or auction block, they generate a mere fraction of their original purchase value. This massive discrepancy between the initial cost of her lifestyle and the desperate fire sale returns left her drowning in a staggering ocean of residual debt. The capital generated from the seizures was insufficient to satisfy the principal loans, leaving the creditors to aggressively target her remaining financial infrastructure. The immediate consequence of this liquidation was the total annihilation of her credit score. In the modern economy, a credit score is not merely a number. It is the fundamental passport required to navigate society. Its destruction effectively excommunicated Paulina from the traditional banking system. She was entirely locked out of the ability to secure traditional refinancing, obtain a standard mortgage, or even lease a basic apartment. The entertainment industry had encouraged her to mortgage her entire future to maintain a temporary television aesthetic. And when the bill came due, she was pushed into the desperate, unforgiving corners of financial destitution. Yet the most agonizing aspect of this financial collapse was the relentless, suffocating pressure to maintain the digital illusion of prosperity. The modern social media landscape is an uncompromising warden. Even as her bank accounts were frozen and her physical assets were towed away, the algorithm demanded a constant, heavily curated projection of success. The psychological terror of publicly admitting defeat, of letting the audience and the industry executives see the ruins of her life, forced Paulina into a state of profound cognitive dissonance. She continued to funnel whatever microscopic, desperately acquired capital she could secure directly into her public relations apparatus. She was actively choosing to pay for professional makeup, social media management, and strategic photography sessions, while silently drowning in final notice creditor warnings. She attempted a final desperate pivot into the world of sponsored digital content, hoping to monetize her remaining follower count. However, the fractional income generated by internet affiliate links and minor brand endorsements was a mere drop of water in the raging inferno of her mounting legal and financial liabilities. The facade had transformed from a career strategy into a heavy, suffocating digital prison. She was trapped on display, forced to smile for an audience while her reality burned to the ground. In a final maneuver to generate sustainable, legitimate cash flow and escape the collapsing wreckage of her entertainment career, Paulina opened a HotWorks fitness franchise in Columbus, Georgia, in the year 2023. To the local community, the regional press, and her social media followers, this venture was aggressively marketed as the triumphant, empowered evolution of an independent businesswoman. It projected the highly marketable image of a savvy reality television star successfully transitioning her athletic background into the lucrative health and wellness sector. The grand opening was framed as a victory lap. The reality operating behind the tinted glass doors of that franchise was a profound, carefully concealed medical tragedy. Investigative sources and industry insiders revealed that the Columbus HotWorks studio was not primarily a calculated business venture. It was a covert, desperate biological necessity. The defining technological feature of the HotWorks franchise is the intensive utilization of infrared heat technology. Paulina was not merely selling fitness routines to local clients. She was utilizing the commercial infrared saunas to self-medicate. The horrific, unmitigated physical trauma she had sustained during her reality television debut, specifically the shattered knee that the production team had exploited for ratings, compounded by the years of untreated spinal compression from her time on the secondary wrestling circuit, had evolved into severe, debilitating, chronic pain. Because she had been classified as an independent contractor, she was entirely denied the comprehensive lifelong medical insurance that a legitimate corporate employer would have provided to an employee injured on the job. Without access to high-tier orthopedic care or specialized pain management programs, she was forced to build an entire commercial business simply to access the daily, high-grade heat therapy required to survive the agonizing physical legacy of her career. The franchise was a frantic, dual-purpose attempt to simultaneously stave off total bankruptcy and manage a failing, permanently damaged skeletal system. She was standing in the lobby of her own business, projecting the vibrant image of an elite fitness entrepreneur while secretly relying on the equipment simply to walk across the room without excruciating agony. She was her own most desperate patient. She is not an anomaly. She is not a cautionary tale of poor personal choices. She is the exact intended byproduct of a corporate system meticulously designed to consume human vulnerability for public amusement. Her life exposes the terrifying predatory loopholes embedded deep within celebrity contracts. The corporate machine specifically targeted her collegiate confidence, isolated her from her support systems, and utilized the intense, highly manufactured pressure of a television production to force her into legally surrendering her fundamental right to medical compensation. The secondary management sector subsequently preyed upon the resulting psychological trauma, utilizing the toxic illusion of fame to trap her in a devastating cycle of high-interest debt and predatory brand agreements. Every single viral moment she produced and every dramatic television rating spike she generated for the billionaire executive class was paid for directly with her own future financial solvency and her permanent physical mobility. The ultimate lesson extracted from the ruins of Paulina's career is a stark, uncompromising condemnation of trading human equity for the temporary power of the broadcast lens. The entertainment industry routinely promises young athletes and performers a pathway to immortality, but it strictly delivers a highly efficient mechanism of extraction. Decades after the Tough Enough cameras stopped rolling, the corporate executives who orchestrated her humiliation continue to profit from the digital syndication and archival streaming of her suffering. Meanwhile, Paulina Thomas remains trapped in the suffocating aftermath of the machine, fighting a daily invisible battle to heal both physically and psychologically. She serves as a permanent, agonizing reminder that when an individual steps into the corporate meat grinder of reality television, the scars are never temporary. The debt incurred is never truly settled, and the human body never forgets the violence it was forced to endure for the sake of the show. True survival in this industry does not come from securing the spotlight. It comes from recognizing the corporate trap before it permanently snaps shut. Paulina Thomas's trajectory is not a cautionary tale of poor personal choices. It is the exact intended byproduct of a system designed to consume human vulnerability. The contract she signed, stripping her of labor rights and granting the corporation perpetual ownership of her image, ensured that decades after the cameras stopped rolling, executives continued to profit from her digital syndication. Her life exposes the terrifying reality of the early reality TV era, a deeply insulated mechanism where billionaires socialize the physical costs onto broken athletes while privatizing the broadcast profits. The human body never forgets the violence it endures for the sake of the show, and in this industry, true survival doesn't come from securing the spotlight. It comes from recognizing the trap before it permanently snaps shut.